this solar sowing system. This is half of the system. The solar array itself is still in Bathurst, and we couldn't bring that down here. So I'll run through all of this, and I'll just give you a brief description on what's still on the roof in Bathurst. And it's a 4.2 kilowatt PV solar array, which is more than enough, which generates more than enough power for this vehicle to operate on an annual basis. That's based on one charge per day. Basically, what we've got here is it was a standard dual cab four-wheel drive vehicle. It now has no diesel motor. That's been taken out. It has a 200 horsepower series wound DC motor, which is direct coupled to the gearbox. So we still have a gearbox. There's no clutch anymore. The electric motors generate massive amounts of torque. So we start in second gear. With a lot of smaller electric vehicles, you can basically select a gear and go depending on how fast you want. We kept the gearbox because we wanted high and low range, so that we've got low range four-wheel drive for work around the farm. And that's specifically what it was designed for. The electric motor obviously needs power. The large toolbox at the front of the tray has a 29 kilowatt lithium ion battery pack. That's fairly new technology, but that technology is moving very, very quickly. The alternative to that was to have lead acid batteries, which would have weighed 700 kilos, and these ones, which have really only just become available in the last 18 months or 2 years, they weigh 300 kilos. So that's almost the difference between something being a viable alternative and not viable for this sort of application. In smaller electric vehicles to drive for commuting, it's not so much of an issue. But the big issue with electric vehicles is range, and that's where the battery technology is really, that's the tipping point, a good tipping point, when you, the tipping point that will make electric vehicles completely viable for everyone. I'll tell you a little bit about this drill, but before I go into that, just in case there are people who don't have an agricultural background, I want to give you an idea of where we've come from historically and how we end up here, and I will be brief. Traditional cultivation involved turning the soil over and ploughing the soil. And this would happen many, many times, and that was to kill weeds, to prepare a seed bed that would improve germination. It was a transported European practice to Australia. In Europe, they do this to dry the soil out, and in Australia that wasn't really necessary, but the practice of preparing a seed bed is one that we went on with, and there could be multiple times during a season prior to planting your crop that you would do it, and maybe 4 times, 5 times. I know when I first went back on the farm, we'd at least have 4 operations before we got round to putting the seed into the ground. From a full tillage, a full soil disturbance background, minimum tillage was developed, and that's probably started when chemicals became available, so that instead of ploughing weeds out, chemicals were applied to kill the weeds, and that didn't require quite so much working of the soil. Then came direct drilling, where you relied completely on chemicals to do the weed killing, and then in one pass, or one direct drill, the seed was put in the ground to sow a crop, or a pasture, for that matter. Then a more recent development is zero-till, and a zero-till, by definition, means that you only have an extremely small percentage of soil disturbance, so less than 5%, but it can be so small as to be almost imperceivable in a paddock. And the original idea was that we were going to do a demonstration on the lawn, which won't be happening, but I can guarantee you if we did do that demonstration, what you would see from this machine, which is, I guess, this is at the leading edge of zero-till technology, you would see a cut in the ground, pretty much like one of the gaps between the flagstones here. And this machine operates with 2 discs. It operates like a pizza cutter. It makes a cut in the soil. The soil's just, the grass is slightly parted, a seed can drop in, and the press wheel at the back just pushes that piece of grass back down, and that's the seed bed. And you don't have to use more aggressive soil disturbance to create a tilth and a seed bed, because the plants themselves have created the perfect environment for young plants, seeds to germinate and grow, because that's the natural system. That's how it works. The plants grow and they drop seeds, and that's how they go from there. So the progression that we've seen in agriculture to now is basically one of less soil disturbance, less environmental impact, much greater fuel efficiency. Simply the act from going from a full disturbance cultivation to direct drilling would probably lead to a 75% decrease in your fuel costs and emissions in the same way. Much reduced chemical usage too. This is one technology that's out there now, which is called weed seeker technology, where every nozzle on a boom spray has a detector in front of it, and the nozzle only sprays when it detects that there's a weed under it, and that saves over 90% of chemicals. So I'm not advocating chemicals, I'm just saying that all of these things are reducing the inputs that are needed. The important ones, I guess, are where we have emissions, but chemicals are also an energy-intensive thing for production. There are a great diversity of options that are available to us, and I think, you know, probably we're going to need to look at all of those options to get through the challenges that we've got in agriculture at the moment, and those challenges are ones that are felt in the broader community as well. This machine is set up to do, for the most part, pasture cropping and no-kill cropping, and that's no-kill with a K rather than a T. And those are both Australian-developed cropping advances. They're not the total answer, but they're another tool in the toolbox, and they can be used in large areas of Australia, particularly where climate variability, so I guess we're really saying they could be used everywhere in Australia, where climate variability has been an issue, and we've definitely had that in the last 10 years. So pasture cropping is where the crop itself is sown into existing pastures, and you use a much reduced level of fertiliser and reduced or no rates of chemicals. The idea is that you retain your pastures, you don't spray it, you're not actually trying to kill that pasture, you're trying to suppress it, and when you sow into a perennial native Australian pasture, especially with a cereal or an annual crop, the native pasture will tend to reduce its activity in winter, and you're sowing a crop in that's active in winter, and it's almost a symbiotic relationship. And by the end of the season, when the crop's ready to harvest, it's slightly shading the native pasture. You harvest the crop, and then the native pasture comes out from underneath. No-kill cropping uses no fertiliser and no chemicals. You don't kill anything. You don't necessarily try and prepare that paddock using livestock. The idea is to retain the full function and diversity of that grassland. Now, both of these methods are less input intensive. They also, one of the most important things with using them is that your grazing, if you have a grazing operation as well, it doesn't disturb that whatsoever. You graze right to the day that you sow, and then the day the crop comes off, you can then continue grazing. That's if you were to take it to the cropping stage. Quite often we just sow those crops as an opportunity crop to increase our amount of dry matter in winter when we might need feed more than other times of the year. Another good plus for them, as well as being low input, is that obviously the environmental outcomes are good. They actually stimulate the native grasses, so you get an increase in biodiversity at the same time. Now, no-kill cropping was developed near Narromine by a fellow named Bruce Maynard, and pasture cropping was developed at Golgong by Colin Sykes.